Now let's look at a vertical translation on our trig functions. You can see here that this is kind of a general equation for that, and when we have a vertical translation, what we really see in the equation is when we're adding a number to the function. So if this is my trig function, like sine, cosine, tangent, if I add or subtract some number to that function, then that is a vertical shift. We are shifting the entire graph vertically, whether that's up or down. So let's identify those parts on this equation down here. This says y is equal to y is equal to 3 minus 2 cosine of 3x. Well, let's start with a, right? A would be the amplitude. When I'm looking at the amplitude right here, amplitude is always the coefficient next to the trig function right there. So in other words, the amplitude is a, but because this has a negative sign in front of it, I know that this graph is going to be flipped. So I'm going to put that down so I know that. The next thing I want to identify is b. b is going to be next to my variable x, right? This is going to be 3. Therefore, the period of the function, which is 2 pi over b, my period would be 2 pi over 3. Now, I'm going to take a second and I'm going to divide up my interval. This says I have a period between 0 and 2 pi over 3. And because I'm looking at that, I'm going to just go ahead and divide this interval up so I know I'm going to eventually break up the x-axis. So I have 0, 2 pi over 3. Halfway in between 0 and 2/3 would be 1/3, or pi over 3. Halfway in between 0 and 1/3 is pi over 6. So what that tells me is that every time I move to these next, every time I increment, I'm incrementing by pi over 6. So here, if I were to add 1/6 to pi over 3, I get the next value, which is pi over 2. And you can find that on your calculator if you didn't know that already. Let's go back. We know A, we know B. Now let's talk about C. C is this value up here. It's totally separate from whatever I have going on next to my trig functions, right? It's just some number all by itself. That value is a positive 3, which means I have a vertical shift up by 3. So let's take this information now and let's graph it. First thing I'm going to do is divide up my number line. I'm going to go down just a little further. So I'm going to divide up my number line. I know I've got an interval between 0 and 2 pi over 3. And I'm going to have another one because I'm supposed to graph this over 2 intervals. So I know I'm going to have some other interval out here. So let's break this up according to what I have up here in green. I know that this one is going to be pi over 3. This is pi over 6. This one was pi over 2 because we already figured that out. We also know, in order to make the next interval here, that one entire period is going to be 2 pi over 3. So here it's 2 pi over 3. My next period occurs in another 2 pi over 3. So we add one full period to this and I get 4 pi over 3. We know that this is going to break up like that. And I know that every time I increment, it's by pi over 6 or 1/6. So if I add 1/6 to each of these values as I'm moving to the right, then I end up with 5 pi over 6. The next value is pi. Then we have 7 pi over 6, ending with 4 pi over 3. So this is just how my x-axis is going to break up. Now let's talk about the vertical shift. The vertical shift has the effect of shifting all of my values up by 3. So we're going to count this off. 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to draw myself an imaginary x-axis just like that. Now, from this imaginary x-axis, or in other words, from this shifted axis, my amplitude is up by 2 and down by 2. So the amplitude is based off of the shifted axis. So we know we're going to go up 2, which would be at 5, and we go down 2, which would be at 1. Now we're ready to actually draw this function. We know that this is a cosine function and that it's flipped. Cosine always starts on the axis right here and not starting at high because it's flipped. We're going to start low. So we start down here at 1. We cross the imaginary axis. We peak, we cross, we end down low. We can keep going. We cross, we peak, we cross, we end low. Now we're just going to connect these into a smooth curve. And you can see that we still have our cosine function. It's just it's been shifted up by a value of 3. And that's how you handle a vertical translation.